Father William Hahn is the Director of Vocations and the Vicar for Clergy for the Diocese of Columbus. He was ordained in 2004 after graduating from the Pontifical College Josephinum. Where else? He has served in parishes as parochial vicar and as pastor for a consortium of 4 parishes based in Chillicothe, Ohio. Father enjoys backpacking, kayaking, hiking, home brewing, reading, and serves on the board and as chaplain for a very cool men's organization here called Wilderness Outreach. Father Hahn is going to update us on vocations in the diocese, and if we are lucky, we may hear a little bit of his own vocation story. Please welcome Father Bill Hahn.
Thanks, Frank, and it's a great privilege to be able to speak to you all today. And I want to thank you as a vocation director for all the work that you do. 4 years ago, when I became the vocation director, I didn't really realize how many allies you need in this. You know, how many allies, and you guys have been great allies here these last 4 years. So it's such a blessing to be able to speak to the greater region, all of you Serra members. Now, we were just talking that Father Stosh and I look so much alike that people are going to assume that we just changed. I put on a jacket, came back in. A couple months ago, I was at an event here, and it was a clergy who cook, and so he and another priest were cooking, and I was visiting, and this lady came up and she said, "Can you stay here for a minute? I have a friend who doesn't believe that there's actually you and also Father Stosh." So she said, "I want to go." So I started talking to somebody else, and then she comes up and she gets me and introduces me, and then we turn around and Father Stosh had left. So her friend was like, "I knew it, it's not true." He is not. Always like seeing Father Stosh. I just don't like following him as a speaker. So the seminarians always tell me about his Mariology class, and they say every class is like going on retreat. And as I was listening to him, I was like, I understand why they say that, right? You just sense the Holy Spirit, and there's things that the Lord, I think, brings to mind as he's speaking. As Frank talked about, my goal today actually will be to share my vocation story and then draw some lessons from that of common things that I'm seeing in the young men that are coming in to our program. And so basically, like I said, I'll just kind of share a bit about my vocation story, how I discerned my vocation, and then we'll return and go through, here are some of the things that were important, and then also what are some things we can do, particularly as Serrans, that help support those. So I grew up just about an hour southeast of here in the area called the Hocking Hills. So small parish down in the hills of southern Ohio, home of Father Jeff Rimmelstock. That was our claim to fame at the time. It still is. So I grew up there, I would say a fairly faithful family. We went to Mass every Sunday. Not real super involved in the parish, but definitely faithful members. So I had a good Catholic upbringing. And then when I graduated from high school, I lived at home and went to a community college for the first year. And I continued very well in the faith during that time. But in the second year, my older brother and a friend of mine, my best friend, we moved out to a cabin deep in the woods, I would say, on the property of my boss, who owned a tree farm. So I was working on a tree farm at the time. So we got this cabin now. We're the first in our age group to have our own place out in the country. So this quickly becomes kind of the party spot for our friends from high school and from that time period. And first time out of the home, as so often happens, we're falling into a lot of excessive drinking and all that. So there's all this partying going on. I can remember one night, the sheriff got called on us, and but he couldn't find the cabin. We were so deep. And the reason that we found out the sheriff was looking for us is the owner was listening to the scanner that night and heard the address of his property. And so we got a pretty fair warning after that about So during this time, I start to recede from my involvement in the faith. I still go to Mass from time to time, especially if I'm on for altar server, which sounds kind of odd as I think back to that time period. But it's at the end of that year, I completed my time at the community college, so now I was going to go to Ohio University in Athens. And I wanted a new beginning. Like, I knew that this pathway was not good for me. For those in Ohio, you know that Ohio University probably not the place to go if you're trying to get away from the party scene. Franciscan University might have been a better choice for me at the time. So basically, as much as I wanted to start a new life, I didn't. I was back into it again. And, it was just like at the cabin days. It was usually, the weekend was like Tuesday through Saturday night. It was an extended time. But on Christmas break, my dad had asked for the Catechism of the Catholic Church for a gift when I asked him a gift idea. So I went and bought him the Catechism, and while I was home on break, I began flipping through the pages. I said, this is kind of interesting. So I went and bought myself one, and then I went back to college for that next semester. And I was reading it, but I was still, this group of friends I had it was just the party scene. So looking back now, it's very funny. The typical Tuesday through Saturday night was out to the bars till about 1:30, come back and read the catechism until about 2 or 2:30 in the morning. The Lord works in mysterious ways indeed. So I made it through the catechism during that time. Again, that desire for something different was still there, but I couldn't figure out where to go next. So I come back for the next year of college. So now coming into my 4th out of 5 years. And it comes January, and a friend of mine invites me to go to the March for Life in Washington, D.C. And although I wasn't ardently in the faith, I'd always been pro-life. My younger brother was mentally handicapped, so I always knew from an early age that it doesn't depend upon how developed you are, or how gifted you are, however, it's simply the value of human life. And I wanted to see Washington, D.C., so I thought, well, I'll just go. I'm sure it'll be a small prayer meeting, and then we'll get to go out and see all the... Yeah, I wasn't familiar with the March for Life. So we get there, and I can still remember coming over the hill near the National Mall and looking down and seeing that sea of people. And it was totally unexpected to me. And as we got closer, I began to see the youth in this march. That was totally unexpected to me. My experience of prayer groups and that kind of thing was all much older people. And so as we're marching in the March for Life, there's this memory that comes to me of the religious sisters who taught us, talking about the church militant, that term church militant, right? It was the first time I realized what they were talking about. I felt like I'm part of the church militant. We're on this mission. We have a clear purpose. And as we're walking, I'm feeling this sense of being alive that I hadn't experienced in many, many years. And it was that sense of being alive and with purpose is what I had been looking for in the party scene and trying to find that sense of a great fire. And as I was looking around, I would see all these statues of Our Lady being carried, the rosary being prayed. And so it was deepening my sense, okay, this is caught up in the Catholic Church. Whatever's happening with me right now, I need to grow closer to this. And so the first thing I got back, I began praying the rosary every day. And that led me then to go to confession. It had been probably 6-7 years since I'd gone to confession. And I remember I was going to go to confession, and I didn't want to go to our parish priest in Logan because my mother was the housekeeper. And I thought, I didn't understand the seal of the confession at the time, so I'll go to Ohio University, to the chapel near there. I'll go to confession there. Well, oddly enough, at Ohio University, there had been a priest who taught some English courses, and I'd had him for the English course, and he was up in his 80s, I would say. But I didn't even think about the fact he might be at this parish, and sure enough, when I went into the confessional, he's like, "Oh, hi, Bill," and I'm like, "Oh, no." just drove 40 minutes from home to try to get away from anybody knowing me, and this is... So I make my confession, and he gives me the best advice. He says, you need to get some new friends. You need to find some community that's going... You can't do this on your own. Like, you've read the catechism, you're praying, all this, but until you find community that's going to support you in this, you're going to keep failing at this attempt. And so I went back home. I was now living at home commuting at this point, and I joined our Knights of Columbus at the time, and that was a great help. Just really good men, good role models. But then that summer I decided, so when I was in Washington, D.C., I had noticed one of the things that caught my attention after the whole event of the March for Life was the dichotomy between the beauty of around the mall and these great national monuments and everything's clean and pristine and beautiful. And then as soon as you drive a little ways out, just poverty everywhere. And so I felt this call to go back to Washington that summer and to work in a soup kitchen in a homeless shelter. So this was huge for me. So I was not a joiner. I was super shy. But now the Holy Spirit was beginning to push me, or Our Lady was pulling me, or both. And so I went to the summer I spent in Washington, D.C., working at a homeless shelter. And it was with a group of young adults. And every evening we would have the evening off free, so we could go into town and see the monuments and see, Washington's a great place when you don't have money, right? Because there's so many free things to do. So we were constantly seeing all of the great sights. But there was this young woman from Malaysia who was part of our group who lived with us, and she would never go with us. And I asked her, where are you going in the evenings when we all go into the city? She said, I walk over to the Basilica of the National Shrine over here, and I go there and pray. And he said, you're in the capital of the free world, and you're wasting every night going to church? I was like, why don't you join us to see all this? And she said, no, this is where I want my evenings. So one night it was raining, and I didn't want to go all the way into the city, so I said, well, I'll walk over with you to the Basilica. So we went to the Basilica, and if you've ever been there, it's a huge, beautiful church with probably 60, 70 side chapels. So we go in, and she brings me up to the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, and we kneel down, the Blessed Sacrament's in the monstrance, start praying. And then I get up, and I go out, and I start going around looking at all the different chapels. And it's probably an hour and a half by the time I get back. And she's still kneeling right there in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. And I asked myself, could it really be true what I've been reading in the Catechism and what the sisters taught us, that this is really God? What else could captivate this woman every night, day after day, to come and kneel before it? And so it began to make me question things, question more deeply. So I had intellectually been able to digest the Catechism, but not much of it had gotten down into the heart and into belief. But that began a profound movement in that direction. The other thing that this woman said, her name was Bibiana. Before the summer ended, she said, have you ever thought about being a priest? And I said, no. I said, that's not for me. I want to get married, I have a good family, I live on a farm, I do taxes half the year, farm work. I had a kind of all my idea what my life was going to look like. And she said, well, is that God's plan for you, or is that your plan? I said, well, aren't they the same thing? She said, well, have you asked him what his plan is? I'm like, no. She said, you might want to start there. So that was the first time in many years, probably, that somebody had asked me, probably since I was in grade school, if I thought about being a priest. And then this whole idea of a vocation, and that I need to be asking God. So I come back at the end of this summer, and I'm coming in now the final year at Ohio University, and I've got these friends at Knights of Columbus, but they're not my age. They don't have to deal with the same things I'm dealing with, the struggles and stuff. So I'm like, well, I'll go to the Newman. I'll give the Newman Center one try. I'll go there and just, see what it's like. So I go to the Newman Center at Ohio University, and it was just a great group of students there, and they immediately welcomed me in, very encouraging. So they play a big part of now pulling me closer to the Lord. And at this point, I remember one of my best friend that I lived with in the cabin, he's just broken up with his girlfriend. His life's kind of in a mess. So why don't you come to the Newman Center with me? This is like the second time. And then, so he said, yeah, okay, I'll try it. So I can remember I was going to meet him, and I was going to meet him at Rax, the restaurant up from the Newman Center. And I'm praying, I'm like, Lord, don't let him show up. Don't let, because so I was so afraid I was going to be embarrassed. Like he was going to be like, are you hanging out with these people for real? Like, are you a religious freak now or something? But he shows up, we go, and then, he loves it too. And so now he's coming back into the faith more. His brother had already had a reversion. That's a whole other story through Our Lady's intercession. So of our kind of small group of friends, only my older brother's now still way out at this point. So that fall, they have a retreat where we have an all-night adoration. And so my slot was 3 o'clock in the morning. I get up, I go in for adoration. Whoever was supposed to go with me, you're going in pairs, they didn't wake up or something. So it's just me and Jesus and the monstrance. And as I'm praying, it begins to hit me like, Lord, this is you. Like you're the Lord who's given me everything. You've given me my life. You've given me my family. You've given me my friends. Like, Lord, whatever you want, I want to give back to you. I want to give back to you. And I felt the Lord say, Bill, I want you in a special way. He didn't say I want you to be a priest, but that's what I began to take it as. I want you in a special way. And so at the end of that retreat, I was really excited. Oh my gosh, the Lord's calling me to be a priest. I'm going to be a priest. I want to be a priest. And I still remember driving back to Logan. I'm thinking, I want to be a priest. I want to be a priest. And then I see the smokestacks of Logan Clay. And all of a sudden, I'm like, I'm going to be a priest. I'm going to be a priest. I'm not going to be a priest. What was I thinking of? It was 3 o'clock in the morning. What was I hearing? And what it was is seeing Logan, seeing where I grew up, it was reminding me of everything I was. And that was not a priest or anything worthy of a priesthood. And so that battle in the soul, between what the Lord's calling us to and who we remember ourselves to be as, or who we think we are. So that starts to get really more intense. And then that January, the youth group in Logan, they're going to a thing called Youth 2000. I don't know if you guys had that in your diocese back probably around the year 2000 is when it was. But it would be this retreat. It would be held in parishes or seminaries, and in this center of the gymnasium, as it was held in, would be this thing called a burning bush. It'd be all these candles. Monstrance would be on top. It was like a 40 hours thing. And there would be talks going on, confession offered. So I'm at this Youth 2000 here in Columbus. And on the last night, on the Saturday night, they do a Eucharistic procession. But before they do the procession, they read that gospel passage where the hemorrhaging woman, and she reaches out, touches the hem of Christ's garment, and she's healed. And they say the priest is going to be walking along with Jesus in a moment, the same Jesus whom she reached out and touched and was healed. So when the Lord passes you by, reach out and touch the humeral veil, the veil that the priest is carrying the monstrance in, and pray with faith. Ask the Lord for something. And so as the monstrance came by me and I reached and I grabbed it and I prayed for two things. I prayed, one, that I'd have the courage to tell people I was thinking about a vocation to the priesthood, because at this point I hadn't shared it with anyone, and it seemed to me such a strange thing that I was afraid to. And two, that my older brother would come back to the faith. So the next morning, on Sunday morning, they at the end of this retreat, they do a vocation call. So they tell everybody, close your eyes, they say, now put up your hand if you've ever thought about a vocation to the priesthood or religious life. So I'm thinking, well, seems pretty safe, everybody's got their eyes closed. I'm like, so like this. Yeah. So then they say, okay, now stand up. I'm like, oh no. But I figured at this point it's too late because they're going to really call me out if I don't stand up. So I stand up and they say, okay, now open your eyes. And I open my eyes, there's like 60, 70 other young people standing. I'm all, thank God, I'm not the only person that was. So I prayed for courage. The Lord instead just tricked me into telling people that about my vocation. So at this point, this is coming to the end of my time in college. And it's March. My brother, so I had given my brother this book called Pierced by a Sword. It was a book that was popular around that time in 2000. And it's kind of apocalyptic, so it was very engaged. Like, young men really loved it because of that part. But it had a great way of just expressing the interplay between heaven and earth, and the prayers of those who have gone before us and how it affects us now. And in one point of the book, it's the Marian. So in some of the Marian apparitions, there's been this idea of a warning where people will be all of a sudden see their souls, like what their sin has done to other people. There'll be kind of this. So one of the characters in the book, this happens to him. So my brother, he's had the book for many months. In March, he picks up that book and he starts reading it. And he gets to that point, and then he just has this profound sense of his sins and what it's done to so many people, his family, his friends, and that kind of thing. So he calls our parish priest and goes to confession. He says, like, a 2-hour confession. So he comes back now. He's on fire with the faith, which I think was a great gift to me, because then I could also share with him this idea about a vocation that I might have. And I still, though, was afraid to commit to anything, or even to call the diocese or anything like that. So I thought, where can I go that's in the middle of nowhere, but I can still pray? And I thought, South Dakota, right? So after I graduate, I go to South Dakota to a monastery there. And I just spend time, weeks in prayer. And then it's early July, and I'm at the Mass with the monks, and it's the first reading of the day is the reading where Elisha calls Elisha, and Elisha seems to pause. He says, "Well, let me first, kill this and take care of my family." And Elijah says, "What have I done to you?" In other words, like, you know what you're supposed to be doing. Go do it. And it just hit me like that was the Lord speaking. Like, you know what you're supposed to be doing. Just go do it. And so at the end of the Mass, I went and I called the vocation director for Columbus, Father Ted Sill at the time, and I said, "I think maybe I'm supposed to be in seminary." I said, "I don't know, like, I'm sensing I might have a vocation." And he said, "Well, if there's any chance of you entering this fall, like, you need to get on a bus, like, tomorrow and get back here." So I'm like, okay. When do I need to see you? He's like, "No, literally, like, tomorrow you need to get on a bus and come back." And so he's like, "There's no way I can get you into seminary in the time otherwise." So that's what I do. I get on the bus and I drive back. I can remember the bus, it was around July 4th, because there's like, in South Dakota, everything's flat, right? So there's like fireworks being seen everywhere. It was maybe the Lord's choreographing, I don't know. So I come back, go through the process, and enter seminary that year. And that was here at the Josephinum, so I did my pre-theology and then theology here. And it was just an amazing formation here. And then at the end in 2004, I was ordained a priest. And as you know, the church's cycle of readings is a 3-year cycle, and so things are set for years in advance. So when I go to celebrate my first Mass, what do you think the first reading of that day is? It was the call of Elisha to Elisha. Like, it was the very same one that I'd been called into seminary by. So the Lord is an artist, I will say. The Lord loves to do those things. So since then, it's been a great blessing. I served with Father Jeff as my first pastor for 2 years at St. Joan of Arc here in Powell, and then down in Chillicothe, Southern Ohio, up until 2000, since 2020. And then I've been in the vocations office since then, and Vicar for Clergy since 2021. So it's been a great blessing, and now as I'm in this position of seeing other young men coming in and hearing their stories, I see some common themes that are through theirs and matches up with mine. The first thing, of course, I'm sure it's been talked about before today, it's always talked about because it is the most important, which is prayer, because we're dealing with divine vocation. Like, a vocation is something that is a gift from the Lord. It's not something that we can just recruit out of people and create these vocations, right? So that prayer. And it's interesting that during this few-year time period in which my brother came back to the faith, my best friend came back to the faith, his brother came back to the faith, like all these conversions, and it's interesting. My best friend's brother, he's a religious brother with the SOLTS, Society of Our Lady of the Trinity now. My best friend, he's married and has 8 kids, works for the National Evangelization Team up in St. Paul. My older brother's married with 8 kids also, and he works at the Catholic Foundation. But like all these trajectories that were set, what was happening in our home parish at that time for just a few years was perpetual adoration. This was a parish of 350 families, and they had perpetual adoration going on in this time period. And I attribute those graces were through such heaven being stormed during that time. So that importance of prayer. There's been questions about, right now we've had probably our largest new class of seminarians this last year in Columbus of 16 new seminarians in 1 year. We're blessed to have 12 in application for next year. People say, what do you attribute that to? One of the things I think is we just went through a huge pastoral reshuffling in our diocese that included a number of closings and mergings and such. And I think people realized what happens when we don't have enough priests, and that people are beginning to storm heaven even more and praying for those vocations and asking the Lord's blessing. And young men are seeing what happens if the Lord's calling them and they don't respond, that there are real consequences to them, to their community, to their family. So I think that's helped a lot through this intensifying of our prayer. Now, I know Serrans are very involved in prayer. We're very blessed with our Serran Club here. They cover everything we do in prayer. So if we have like a Quo Vadis retreat, I'll come back to that, but they'll have a sign-up genius thing where every hour will be covered praying for it. Or come and see, when we have the come and sees here at the seminary, they'll make sure every hour is covered with prayer. We even have them praying now for our priest convocation, covering all that in prayer. So Serrans are doing a wonderful job of just blanketing everything we're doing in prayer. And there's one last part on this prayer thing that I need to make mention of. It is like what I call purifying our prayer. I don't only bring this up, maybe you guys don't struggle with this, but I definitely did. So when I was first vocation director, I was in prayer one morning in my holy hour in the cathedral where I live at, and I was begging the Lord, we need more seminarians. That year, my first summer there, we had only one seminarian come in, so only one new seminarian. So I'm just like, Lord, we need more vocations, we need more priests. And I felt the Lord say, why are you praying that? I'm like, because look around, like, we are running out of priests in this diocese. He's like, no, like, look deeper. I'm like, I realized the reason I was praying for more vocations is because I look bad as the vocation director. We don't have vocations. So my intention was not very pure. So I felt like I say to the Lord, but Lord, in the past I was praying for vocations in the right way, right? And then I felt like the Lord say, look again. And I realized that I was praying particularly because Logan is a small town where I was from, as I mentioned. And I was afraid it would be one on the block that would have to be closed. And so I was praying that we'd have more priests so that my family, like things would go on as they'd always went on. So the Lord reminded me of that famous passage, which is in Matthew's. It's also in another gospel, but in Matthew's it's kind of worded this way, which is, beg the master of the harvest to send out laborers for my harvest. And the Lord said, well, now look at where that came out of, what led up to that. And so I backed up a few lines, and it says that the Lord's heart was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And I feel like the Lord say, until you start praying for vocations because you see the pain in the world around you, you see the fatherlessness of this society and this culture, until you start praying because your heart has been moved with compassion and pity for the people who do not yet know my son, I will not answer. But if you start praying, and I mean the whole diocese, the whole church, for the right reason, which is that your heart's moved with compassion and pity, that you live in a time of fatherlessness, then I will bless. And so that purifying of our prayer, like why do we pray for vocations? Is it because we want our church and everything to go on as it always has? Or is it because our hearts are being broken in what we're seeing around us? and the pain we're seeing in the eyes of the people we meet. So prayer. The second one is communities that have a sense of mission. So, with my group of friends, we're reminded of the power of community, right? So it's like when we were growing up, we were all in the church, we were all together, and as together we were all involved. Then we get out of high school, we're in this cabin together, and we begin to start to recede from that, and that just kind of multiplies because now you're a community that doesn't go. And even I had that in my heart, right? I said I wanted to change. Every year I told myself I was going to do different this year. But that community I was with just kept pulling me. The power of community. And so, the Newman Center, how once I entered into that, then it brought me, again, that community was what carried me. The Christian journey is never alone. And so the supporting of communities on mission. This came pretty impactful to me recently about communities that know they're on mission. So my oldest nephew was married last May. I got to do the wedding. It was a beautiful, beautiful wedding. He's wearing a beautiful bride. She's also very Catholic. They're both strong in their faith, but they're not in any kind of Catholic community. I'd always say it was despite not being in the Catholic community. So at the reception, I went to the reception afterwards, and it was like a typical, I'd say, a secular wedding reception. I just felt so alone, and even amongst my family and everything. And I was like, what is this about? Like, why do I feel so lonely here? Do you know how sometimes the Lord will intensify an emotion, and then you have to go back and ask, like, are you trying to get my attention on something? So I was struggling with this, and so oddly, the next week I was scheduled to celebrate the wedding of a couple who are missionaries with Damascus, the Catholic Youth Summer Camp, and all that. And I was beginning to dread. I'm like, gosh, do I really want to go on to that reception? Like, it's going to be a repeat. But I had told them I would go to the reception. So at the reception, Damascus is a community of people who know that they're on mission and that everybody has a mission. And so, like, all the toasts, everything were about this mission of this couple and what this couple has a mission and I was like, wow, this is where I belong. Like, and I realized what the difference is that as a priest, if you're in a community that doesn't have a sense of mission, you feel so weird. You feel so different. But when you're in a community that knows it's on mission, then everybody has a mission, well, you feel normal. And this was really reaffirmed for me last month when I have a Melchizedek project, a discernment group down at Ohio State University, which recently went through, about 2 years ago, the bishop did some reorganizing. What to say, the bishop did some reorganizing and set it in the direction of being on mission. And so I have this group of guys that are discerning, and the question was asked, what has helped you in your discernment? And a couple of them immediately both said, being at Buckeye Catholic, which is the group at the Newman Center, he said at Buckeye Catholic, it's normal to know that you have some kind of mission. And they said, so we feel so normal, like talking about we're discerning the priesthood because everybody else is also talking about discerning what they're supposed to be doing for the Lord, what their mission in this life is. I thought that's why we're getting a number of guys out of places like Damascus who have had that encounter, St. Paul's Outreach, Focus, Fellowship of Catholic University Students. Like these communities where it's just normal to know that you are made for mission for the Lord. And so it's easier to discern in those places. And so that's a great thing to support. Like in your own diocese, if you know that there are these missionary-oriented groups, helping to support them. We're very blessed here. We have every year, we started this a couple years ago, that we have a big dinner for all the lay missionaries. So in our diocese, that would be the Damascus missionaries, St. Paul's Outreach, Focus, Urban Encounter, missionaries, the poor. So there's a number of groups. So we get them all together with our seminarians, all dispersed through the tables. And it's Serra Club members who put on that dinner. They do kind of the work to arrange it all, coordinate it all. They do a great job of making it a beautiful event. So that's another thing that you might, if that's not done in your diocese and is something, you might consider that. Because it does many things, but two of the main things I see is that it gets our seminarians around the future leaders in the parish, right? The lay leaders. So a lot of these missionaries are going to end up in our diocese and probably will be active in their parish, and they'll have these friendships now. And then two, it lets those missionaries know that the seminarians are just normal guys, and that they too could be discerning, a little bit more concretely now when they meet the seminarians. So that's something else that could be done. So prayer, communities with a sense of mission, altar serving, which, during that time period, I'd say it was odd that I would be like living out in this cabin and we'd have these parties. And I remember one time I was up until 5 a.m. and then drove in for the 8 o'clock mass for serving. It was like this sense of, it was an all-boys server group at the time, and you had this sense of fraternity and this obligation, like you didn't want to let down your brothers by not showing up, and they got you in the presence of the priest on a pretty regular basis. So that's something that we're seeing. The parishes that have either like MC programs, where it's just groups of boys that are serving together, are helping to lead the serving. There's the Knights of the Holy Temple, which is a national group, but it's a similar thing. It's getting the boys together to serve as a corps, as a fraternity. And as an example, St. Paul Church, which is over in Westerville, a suburban church here, which hadn't had vocations for decades, they started this 3 years ago, and we already have 2 guys in the seminary from there, and there's a number of other guys there that are discerning from it. So anything that creates this kind of altar-serving group of guys, of boys together, is a great thing. And those ones work well, even if you also have girls serving, because the group is separate from the regular servers. Like the Knights of the Holy Temple is just the all-boy group, or the MC program is just the all-boy group. So that's the third. And then the final one is invitation. So I mentioned that Bibiana, the girl from Malaysia, was the one to begin planting that seed again by asking me how I thought about a vocation. And I know as a priest, particularly around the time of the McCarrick thing, it almost felt embarrassed to ask boys if they thought about the priesthood during that, when kind of the whole church we were kind of in a dark place. And I think that had been a problem. I think now the church is much more confident, and we need to be more confident in asking guys. What would be my recommendation here is that when you do ask a young man to consider the priesthood or say, have you thought about the priesthood, back it up with something that you saw in them that made you say that. And it should be something that you think would be good in a husband and a father. That would be good in a husband and a father. Because too often it'll be like, well, that guy doesn't seem to fit in anywhere. Let's ask him, so we make him the priest. So he may have a call, but that shouldn't be the reason that we're asking a young man. It should be something like, I saw you as an MC, and the way you work with your servers, you're like really engaged, trying to oversee them and take care of them. Or I noticed the way you sacrifice your time for the church, the way you're always giving, I see that powerfully in you. Have you ever thought about the priesthood? That kind of way of giving something concrete to the young man, so you can think about that. So those would be, I'd say, the kind of the 4 I draw out of my vocation story. Looking at prayer, at those communities that are on mission, helping to support those kind of communities, altar serving, and then invitation, inviting those. Now, before I move for questions, I want to just give an overview of a few more things that are going on in our diocese that I think the Lord is using as a channel to help vocations. I mentioned Quo Vadis already, and you may be familiar with Quo Vadis. It's like a discernment camp for high schoolers. It's usually maybe 3 days or so. The seminarians are the ones who normally put it on, and they'll have some of the priests and religious give talks at it. That's been a very successful one. Every year we get probably 2 or 3 of the kids end up going into the seminary in the future. So Quo Vadis, and the Serrans often help us with the funding of that. One of the things they helped us a couple of years ago we added was to have a luncheon over here for all the families of the Quo Vadis kids, so that their parents, one of the things we have to do is restore the trust between parents and families and the institutional church. So those kind of things, because their kids were coming home from Quo Vadis on fire and excited about the idea of the priesthood, but a lot of times their parents were still kind of, I think why don't you go do something else first? Because they didn't maybe trust the priest, the bishop, they didn't trust. So this is kind of a way to help with that. Another thing we did was started having regional vocation promoters. So every deanery in our diocese, there's a priest who's assigned to be the regional vocation promoter. This was very timely. We started this towards the end of my first year, and I gave the guys an overview, the priests who agreed to do this, what it would be, and then I was named Vicar for Clergy about 6 months later. And I called the guys back together and said, your job's just increased because I don't have the same time I had before. So they're the first line. So if a guy calls into the vocations office, then our administrative assistant connects them with their local regional vocation promoter so they can get a quicker response and somebody local. So that's been a great help, because those priests are also kind of at times filtering through, sometimes it's very clear that a guy doesn't have a vocation or needs more time or that kind of thing. So they handle that. They also will sometimes offer a Melchizedek project, a discernment group, those kind of things. And then what I would say finally as the most important, and when I first became vocation director, I read this quote from the vocation director for the Dominicans of the Eastern Province, who have been astounding in their vocation promotion. They're probably one of the strongest religious orders possibly in the world. But their vocation director was asked, what are you doing for promotion that's doing this? And he said, really, I don't focus on promotion hardly at all. He said, what I focus on is, what do we do once God sends these men to us? Like, what do we do for formation? Are we giving them everything, the best we can give them? Because if we do that, then God's going to keep sending more, because he's going to want them to get that good formation. And I think that is so key, that formation. The Josephinum is a great place. Mount St. Mary's, we use in Cincinnati, a great place. It's been said that the seminaries today are probably the healthiest that they have been in American history. In fact, whenever I go to national vocations conferences, there's often priests from Europe and from other places that are there because they're trying to figure out what's going on in America. Like what is the formation that's attracting so many vocations compared to the rest of the Western world? So one of the things that we did in Columbus is what we call a culture building of our own diocesan seminarians. So my first year here was COVID. It was the 2020 summer through, so it was right after COVID. There was all the still those lockdowns and all this kind of thing. And because of that, there were the final 3 weeks of the Josephinum seminary for that year were basically canceled because it had so many people from out of the state would have been quarantined their entire 3 weeks had they come. So Bishop Brennan at the time had me gather all of our guys together at St. Therese Retreat Center, which is the old retreat center here in Columbus. And he said, one of the things I want you to work on is their attitude, because the rector had pointed out that it was a really tough year, but a lot of that was because of the Columbus guys. And so we had Mr. John Bradford, who does wilderness outreach, which works a lot with men and with leadership. He came in and led them through a few exercises, and then they began having these conversations. The question was put to them, when you have young men coming to look at the seminary, what kind of culture would you have wanted to encounter when you came? Is it a negative culture that's always talking bad about other people? Is it a culture that... And they came up with 4 virtues that they would strive for as a community. And then they have one seminarian who's tasked with keeping everybody else on track. So they meet usually weekly. Are we living up to our virtues? And I remember the rector calling and saying, I don't know what happened, but he said, it's completely changed our culture now. It was such a... because the seminarians were taking unto themselves, what do we want to be? What do we want to be as a group? And so I would say at this point in time, it's a great time for vocations. It's a great time for the church, as Father Stosh was talking about. It's as it gets darker, those lights begin to shine even more. And I'm amazed at every vocation story, every young man who comes, and I interview them. Every time I'm just amazed at how the Lord is working in the midst of a culture that seems to be spiraling out of control. And yet the Lord's bringing more and more and more. And there's this kind of discipleship that's growing. So praise God for that, and thank you as Serrans for all the work that you do to help support our vocations in so many different ways. So thanks.